Welcome to EFO Talks. With me today is Sebastian Schaefer. He's a brilliant chap. He's a friend of mine. He's the director of the Institute for the Danube region and Central Europe. He has edited a book on Ukraine in Central and Eastern Europe, Kiev's foreign relations, foreign affairs and international relations in the post-communist period. Without further ado, Sebastian, welcome to EFO Talks. What triggered your book?
Atul, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. It's a great pleasure. And, if we dive into it right away, the idea for the book was born more or less 3 years ago, I would say. I remember my colleague and friend of mine, Andreas Umland, wrote an email to the IDM about the idea of thinking about holding a conference on Ukraine and Central and Eastern Europe. And the very idea, what is Central Europe today? How do we view Ukraine? And especially also, how do the neighboring countries of Ukraine view the country itself? And then, if you remember 3 years ago, at around this time, something happened that drastically influenced all of our lives. And then basically, the overall idea had to be postponed. We then met in September 2020 in Vienna, gathered a few people, because it was not possible to have a bigger conference, but we did that in a hybrid format, which also enabled us to have then, of course, various people from various countries joining. And we talked about what Ukraine's foreign policy in relation to those countries and also to international organizations, and here especially then the European Union, is like. And then after 5 hours of live streaming, we said, well, that was a great experience, but maybe we should further, so to say, record it, not only on a YouTube video, but write something down. And that's what we did, because Andreas is the editor of this book series, which is called Soviet and Post-Soviet Politics and Society. And this is the wonderful result that we've achieved.
Brilliant. Quite a good book cover. So what is Central Europe? What is Eastern Europe? Where does the boundary lie?
That's a very good question. And I think we could have several talks on this. But of course, as...
At least it's talks now instead of armies deciding the boundaries.
But if you see the map behind me, which is the map of the target countries of the IDM, I would say this is what we understand of Central Europe. It's a broader notion, bound together by the river Danube. But I think it's also a post-colonial approach towards it, in the sense that the region, and Andreas and Pavel Klimkin write this also in their foreword for this book, that the region has been influenced by several empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, etc. And so what they have in common is that they are so to say influenced by these empires vanishing. And Central Europe today, for me, especially when we look at the tasks of what IDM is trying to achieve, is of course European integration. And for me, Central Europe, everything, including what is a candidate country to become an EU member today, is for me Central Europe.
Sebastian, before we crack on, again, is there a distinction between Central and Eastern Europe, or is that an entity that coalesces together? Because it's very hard to put a boundary between the Eastern and the Central parts.
That's true. So what I would say, the CEE region, Central and Eastern European region, is that what I've just described. And I would say that we could, depending on cultural but also historical ties, see it in a broader or in a more narrow sense. But I would rather not see a boundary or distinction or alienation between Central and Eastern Europe. I would rather see that this is a common region that is bound together by that river, the Danube and others.
Yeah. I mean, before we get into the next question, I remember telling you when we first spoke that I fell in love with the Danube years ago when I took the boat up Budapest. And it is a magical river. It is one of the great rivers of all civilizations, actually. So let's get on to more important topics or more timely topics. The geopolitics of post-communist Central and Eastern Europe is important, and in particularly after communism fell, is important not only for Ukraine itself, which finds itself at war with Russia, but also for Europe as a whole. So once the Soviet Union breaks up, once 1991 comes, and you have an independent Ukraine, what have been Kiev's relationships with the capitals of let's say, Central and Eastern European countries and those in the Southern Caucasus?
Well, it varied through a great extent, I would say. But what was very common, especially with the region that you mentioned, both Central and Eastern Europe, but also the Southern Caucasus, that from a very early stage on, the relationship was centered around European but also transatlantic integration, and this is not something that has just recently popped up, or is framed from time to time that there would be some so to say geopolitical influence from outside being brought towards Ukraine. No, that was very early on in the 1990s. Actually also written into the Constitution. So while there was, of course, a different relationship to, Berlin than to Chisinau, which is the capital of Moldova, the neighboring country, nevertheless, I would say that this is a broader approach towards the region, the, so to say, start of becoming sovereign and also emancipating itself from the Soviet past. And
so was the transatlanticism driven by security considerations? Some of my friends who are scholars like you argue that the EU was a refuge for economic reasons and for establishing democracy, and for security, because the EU countries hardly spent anything on security. Eastern and Central European countries looked to the US, to Washington, for guarantee against Moscow. Would that be a fair characterization, Sebastian?
Absolutely. And I think it's something that nowadays still is one of the big challenges that we are seeing. And that currently, of course, with the Biden administration, we have a US president who is very pro-NATO and very committed to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But this can easily change, and we've seen what the previous administration has helped from NATO. And therefore, the European Union really needs to also become a bit more resilient, not only when it comes to economic terms, but also when it comes to these security aspects. And what you have said, I think, is very true for Central Europe, but also true to a certain extent in the past decades for more Eastern Europe, and even more so to today's Ukraine.
Got it. I mean, we are seeing noises about it. French President Emmanuel Macron has been talking about having a Europe which takes more responsibility about its security. The French, actually, going back to Charles de Gaulle, believed in it. And in fact, Charles de Gaulle took France out of NATO. But the rest of Europe has been very hesitant and actually reluctant to move away from the umbrella of the US or to develop its own alternative. So you're right that the US could be flaky, but Europe as yet, I don't know if it's ready for that security alternative.
I don't think it's ready in a sense that we have a coherent approach towards it. As you mentioned, I mean, also France has been, you was flaky. They withdrew from the military component of NATO, then returned. Then it was Macron who said NATO is brain dead. Now it's sort of back. But if we look at other countries that are, especially in this war, not clearly positioning themselves, I'm speaking about Hungary, that advocate on an EU level to a more different approach than it has been the solidarity of most of the EU member countries towards Ukraine. But then we have also other countries that are neutral. And for them, the neutrality is a very important aspect. I'm speaking here, of course, then mainly of Austria. Other countries like Sweden and Finland immediately, as a reaction, threw that overboard and tried to become a member of NATO. So what I'm trying to say is we have a variety of foreign policy and also especially security policies within the European Union where I see there might be the overall challenge that we see in so many times when it comes to EU policies, that there is much more to be achieved if you act together, but we always sort of end up at the smallest common denominator. And I'm afraid that this is also the case when it comes to the security question, and this is why NATO, I would say, will remain important for the foreseeable future.
Now, you've mentioned the differences between countries in the EU. Let's go to the Central and Eastern European countries, nation states, whatever you want to call them. And there too you have a variety of interests. So walk us through the different interests. For instance, on the map I see Poland. Poland has a different set of interests. They have lots of Ukrainian refugees. The Czech Republic is different. The Slovenes are different. Austria is, of course, wedded to its idea of neutrality. And then Hungary, of course, has issues with its border with Ukraine. It feels this is a war between two Slavic nations, both of whom oppressed Hungarians. So, I mean, there's a whole variety of narratives and memories and interests. So walk us through that and educate us as how this patchwork works.
Well, it's of course a lot more complicated than I could answer in a sort of brief time frame here. Yeah. But
give us a window, give us a glimpse. That's it.
Yeah. I think that we have to distinguish, on the one hand side, those countries that have had a historic memory of the Soviet Union and its relationship towards it, although we have to make an exception with Hungary here, which puzzles me, which I really don't understand. And I also remember still when Viktor Orban reminded of what happened in 1956 when the Red Army crushed the demonstrations in Budapest, which...
It was the first one. It happened 12 years before Prague.
Yes.
Prague happened in 68. Yeah. And 56 was ghastly. It was absolutely savage. Well, one can still see bullet marks in Budapest.
Yeah. And this is sort of, I don't know, erased from his memory. I mean, he's very, very flexible in terms of securing his own power. But this is something that really baffles me. There is, you mentioned Poland, and there's a completely different memory to that, and it has actually driven a wedge between Warsaw and Budapest, the attitude towards the war in Ukraine. We have a different attitude, for instance. I mean, it's not that much Central Europe, but still, in Germany, we have a very different experience from the history as it has been divided. And you can see that, on the one hand, they are very reluctant when it comes to dealing with providing weapons to Ukraine due to historical reasons, as they claim. But on the other, and these historical reasons stem back to the Second World War. But then there is also this more recent historical connection in Eastern Germany, which, having lived there myself, this nostalgia or Ostalgia, because East is in German is Ost, and so they call it Ostalgia, towards the former GDR, which was also, people at the border died. It was a brutal regime. So to say, is this memory is gone after only 30 years, and there is some sort of nostalgic memory of the times as it has been there. And then, additionally to that, I would say there's countries that actually have been part of the Soviet Union, but have a very different status nowadays. That's the Baltic states, who are members of the EU and NATO, which have a very vivid memory of how the breakup here was. And then we have a country which is on the other side here on my back, Moldova, which also has been part of the Soviet Union. Nowadays is a neutral country as well, but very much under the influence of the Kremlin, and has a frozen conflict inside of its country as one of the first violent consequences of the breakup of the former Soviet Union, with the civil war happening in the Transnistria region.
Yeah. So what are the interests now? What are the interests of the different capitals in this region? Are they, you've already alluded to tensions between Warsaw and Budapest. What about the smaller countries? What about, say, Prague? What about Bratislava? What about Vienna? How are the different powers pulling and pushing together?
Also not so easy to answer, because the beauty of that countries that you have mentioned, but also the challenge here, is that they are all democracies, and they have elections and their governments change. And while we know how Putin will perceive his point and how he will never cave in, because that's the end of his regime, we have policies changing, and I'm not stating the obvious just for that fact, but the countries you mentioned, we had recently presidential elections in Czechia, but we have a interim government in Slovakia. They will have parliamentary elections in the fall. Poland has regular parliamentary elections, which will also happen in the fall. So Austria will have elections next year. So you see, there's a very these are factors that are also influencing how these countries are viewing the situation, because they very much changed. And in the election, this war and the relationship amongst each other in the region, but especially towards Kiev and with Ukraine, will be points that will be brought up in these electoral campaigns. We could see that in the presidential elections in Czechia. Here, a former general won, who was also very much experienced in NATO, and of course he has an understanding of the consequences for the destruction of the security architecture in Europe that resulted from this unprovoked invasion, full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation in Ukraine, whereas his opponent, former prime minister of Czechia, had a completely different stance and said, we need peace. So we have not only a patchwork of countries in that region, but we also have a patchwork of policy towards that which is, as I said, the challenging but also the good thing, because it's a clear sign of a democratic decision-making process.
Understood. So what you're pointing out is that none of these countries are entirely coherent, and there are competing voices within each of their polities. And democracy is messy, and there are push and pull factors that could pull this region in either direction. Which brings me on to another question, which is, if that is the case, and as the economic costs of the war mount, then what happens?
Very good question. We see that these arguments are already being brought up. It was quite recent when Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, said we need to have peace immediately, otherwise hyperinflation, which is very high in his country. I'm not an economist, so I can really not judge. I can only rely on what I've read about it, which is not entirely only the fault of the geopolitical situation, but also to blame due to the actions or inactions of the government. But
it's a bit like Turkey. Turkey is, of course, the extreme example. The Turkish inflation is crazy because Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in fact, slashed interest rates instead of raising them. It was complete madness. It was, I call it Erdonomics. So, of course, Hungary is not as bad as Turkey, but they've not been wise with their policies either.
No. So, and that is, of course, easier than to build on these narratives, where we need to strive for peace immediately, which is simply impossible for various reasons, and we can maybe talk about that. But then there is other countries who show more solidarity, but if that will continue, I also can see, and I think that this is one of the long run games that Putin is batting on, that this will show further cracks, and this might then to lead to more countries breaking away from that solidarity, and this is a very real danger. On the other hand, I think we have mobilized much more on a EU scale on the financial and economic crisis in 2007, 2008, and also to alleviate the situation during the coronavirus pandemic in 20 and 21. So I think there's much more possibility to work together and alleviate the economic ramifications of that war. But of course, you need to have the backing of the societies, and you need to very much explain why the situation develops like it is. And I think this is part of the tasks that we want to achieve with doing things like this, because it's not only writing books. You need to talk to people. You need to try to explain certain things, and something that you, with Fair Observer, are also contributing to.
Well, thank you. Now let's talk about the risk of fragmentation versus the possibility of solidarity. Ukraine's economy went down by 35% last year. Russia's economy went down only by 2.2%. The IMF had estimated it would go down by over 8% or something. And actually this year, the Russian GDP is likely to grow. Do you think there is appetite in the region and in the wider EU to support Ukraine?
So,
I mean economically, not just militarily.
Yeah. I think that the necessity to ramp up also certain aspects of a war economy that the Russian Federation certainly has done would be something that we might need to consider also on an EU level. There have been talks about using the scheme that they did to commonly purchase vaccines. Could be used to commonly manufacture ammunition, which I have no idea, because I'm neither a specialist in a virus and also then not in military aspects, so I have no idea if that would function, but on a very basic level, that seems to make sense to me. And we should not only think about these short-term solutions, but it will also have further implications for in the long run, because we have not invested enough in security in Europe, and this is something that we need to learn as a lesson out of this. I would say, full disclosure, I would have to say that I was always arguing that this 2% goal of NATO, of spending of GDP for defense and security is something that is a thing of the past. I was gravely mistaken here, but when we look at the Russian Federation and the numbers that you mentioned, I think that there are, on the one hand, it's hard to judge because the 2.2% come from the Kremlin. It's hard to fully evaluate what is going on because it's very, very restricted already before a challenge. And two contributing additional factors, I would say. First, they are fully swinging into a war economy. And they are drafting people, and this sort of substitutes the challenges for the economy that certainly have not had a high effect as it maybe was expected, resulting from the sanctions, which is also a reason because some of the full implementation of getting rid of the dependency on natural resources coming from the Russian Federation is not equally implemented by all EU member countries and countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And on the other hand, we must also not forget that hundreds of thousands of Russians have fled the country in fear of being drafted, which means that the unemployment very low at the moment because people are either filling what is necessary on the labor market or are being sent to Ukraine to fight this senseless war.
So, what is Kiev doing to counter Moscow right now?
On the one hand side, of course, and people point to that where will it end? Because every time the Ukrainian president asks for weapon delivery, something else comes up, which I would counter that he is doing what he can in order to get the support when it comes to arming Ukraine to be able to defend itself. This is the one thing. Then, on the other hand, of course, what he's also doing is trying to use the opportunity, the window of opportunity for European integration, and it's really remarkable to see how they are able to pursue certain reforms, given the current circumstances that the country is under, where there is war and destruction, not only in a classical sense between soldiers fighting, but there's critical infrastructure and civilian infrastructure being targeted from Moscow. And the third thing that he is doing and Kiev is doing here is also thinking about how to use the possibility of the reconstruction that will certainly happen after the war. So there is a I would say a security military aspect to it. There's a cultural integration aspect to it, and there is also a economic reconstruction effort going on, but it ultimately hinges on Russia stopping trying to invade the country.
Mm-hmm. All right. So even as Russia has been invading the country, a large number of Ukrainians have fled, and a lot of them have fled to Poland. And Poland is hosting these refugees. I have a friend's father who's hosting refugees as of now in Poland. I think it's Rejo or something. I'm maybe not getting the name right. But there's also talk of Poland supporting Ukraine more strongly. Poland has already shared its Leopard tanks. It's probably been the first. So what will Poland's role be going forward, and how will Warsaw-Kyiv relations change?
I think that they already have changed over I would say since 2014, when Crimea was annexed and the war in Donbass started, and it's only continuing to evolve to a even closer cooperation. And I think this is not only for the reason that they share a border, and as you correctly said, they have the majority of the refugees coming there in vast numbers, but there is additionally to that, not important, less important maybe the historical ties, but additionally to this proximity and the shared experience with the bigger neighbor in the east. I think what is important here also is that they have had common ties. Already before the war started, there was the European Football Championship in 2012. There is a understanding that this neighborhood is something that has a lot of potential, and another factor that has grown. If you look at the voting power in the European Council, with the double majority on a European level, it has increased the most for Poland due to Brexit. So UK leaving, which was also, of course, an important factor security-wise for those two countries, Poland and Ukraine, and still remains to do so, but was for Poland especially important on an economic level within the European Union. That changed, and it also changed the balance, not only the geographical center of the EU, but also the voting power in the EU, which is not that drastic, but there will be this, I would call it informal voting power, resulting from the countries of Central and Eastern Europe having constantly warned about the possibility that there will be further Russian expansion attempts, which have been vastly ignored by Western European countries. And that will additionally shift the power within the EU towards Central Europe, and that will also then have an influence, I would say, with regards to the European integration of Ukraine.
So you think the balance of power within the EU is shifting, and Brexit means that Poland has become more powerful and will become more powerful, and similarly the region will also have more of a say, especially after the war.
Yes, I mean they should have had that already. I would say, I mean the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that we've been talking about have joined the EU in 2004. That's almost 2 decades ago, and this is something that we cannot speak about a new member country anymore. That is 2 decades in a supranational organization. But at the same time, also what we have seen is when we look at the top jobs on the European level after the last parliamentary elections in 2019, we've seen that they are occupied by founding members. Commission president from Germany, parliamentary president was at that time from Italy. Now it's Malta in the routine rotation, but nevertheless, it was Italy back then. High representative for the common foreign and security policy from Spain, ECB, France, etc., etc., and almost no top job representation from Central and Eastern Europe. That has to change anyways, and I'm convinced that it will change after the next election and also in the upcoming years. Yes.
Mm-hmm. All right. So going forward, how should Ukraine engage in the region between the Baltic, Adriatic, Black, and Caspian Seas?
I think what they are currently doing is already the right approach, trying to counter the narratives, which is very important. This is not only a war that is fought on a battleground; it's also a war. It sounds like a phrase, but it's the reality. It's a war that is fought also on social media and even traditional media, because it's a very important factor. Television, especially for propaganda purposes in the Russian Federation, but also a source of information still for a great majority of the population in the region. So trying to counter this propaganda and narrative that is coming from the Kremlin is an effort that it's a huge task, but they're doing that very well. And since you mentioned the different seas, also if it's to a lesser extent the Caspian Sea, but there's the Three Seas Initiative, for instance, which is another minilateral format between the Baltic, the Black, and the Adriatic Sea that brings together these countries in the region. There's various other formats. There is even a macro-regional strategy called the European Union Strategy for the Danube region, which I think also holds a lot of potential, although I'm critical of having a lot of different minilateralisms with less output. I would say we are on a good way forging these connections, but now we should then focus on the outputs a bit more. And this will be continuing to be the task of Kiev to forge these alliances and also see how this war overshadows a lot of challenges at the moment. Because if you need to fight for your survival, then you maybe can less take care of other challenges around you. But it doesn't mean that they are going away. And this will be something that is important for European integration. And also, if I may just add, when we talk about the region, in the wider the region, here we have the Western Balkan countries who also want to become a member country of the European Union. And we must not forget that they are candidate countries for also 2 decades. And it would be a fatal signal if there has to be a war that you are recognized for further European integration. That should not go to the expense of Ukraine's prospects, but vice versa, it should also not go on the expense of the Western Balkan countries who want to become a member of the European Union.
That's a very interesting point. I suspect you refer to former Yugoslavia and the tensions bubbling right now in places like Kosovo.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So you've already talked about multilateral structures and networks, and the region has the Organization for Democracy and Economic Development, the Visegrad 4, the Bucharest 9 group, and the Three Seas Initiative. Do these do much? Do these even matter?
Yeah, it's a very, very relevant question that I ask myself on a regular basis. Actually, I just finished an article on that question 2 days ago. It's something where I say, on the one hand, it's good to have formats where people meet and talk to each other, because it's, again, another phrase, but still, if people are together and talk to each other and actually also listen to each other, because there are other formats where there have been talks going on with the Russian Federation, for instance, the OSCE, but it was merely like reading statements to each other and not paying attention, not listening to understand and maybe try to find a common ground, but rather just getting the points across. In these formats that you mentioned, I think that there is a common interest which has the potential to contribute to the reconstruction efforts that will be necessary once this war is finally over. Especially the 3 Cs initiative, Bucharest 9 rather, as a sort of security-related format to meet and talk about threats and challenges here. But overall, the correct question here is what is the output? What does it matter that they do that? And I think that especially when you are a smaller country and you have all these different minilateralisms that do not have an institutional seat, but they meet, the challenge is, can you actually stomach that? And does it provide additional output for your foreign policy goals? And this is a question that we should ask ourselves. Don't we have a very good foreign policy format that we could expand, institutionalize, and on the one hand side, with bringing other countries to the table, not necessarily into the structure itself, but to the table? And also, on the other hand, can we maybe reform decision-making in that format so that we do not need unanimity all the time? And I'm talking about the European Union. We have in foreign policy still the necessity that each and every member country needs to give its consent. Why are we not reforming, institutionalizing qualified majority in foreign policy on an EU level, and then also find formats where we cooperate in a broader format on this EU level with partners, friends, shared interest countries to find a format that actually produces output and not only has nice meetings and on a regular basis.
Well, okay, that nicely sets up my next question. You've alluded to the various challenges, the various roadblocks, logjams in Europe, given the nature of these international institutions. Russia, on the other hand, you've already said, is ruled by one man and one man alone, Vladimir Putin, and has a far more concerted focus when it comes to projecting power. And the question I have is, could Moscow counter Kiev in this region? They've meddled in Moldova for a while. You spoke about it. Hungary and Russia have cozy ties. You alluded to it. Could it be that given such slow decision-making and need for consensus, that Russia could move swiftly and decisively and actually gain the upper hand?
Not militarily, but it has been doing that on a more subversive level for I would even say decades. And adding to the countries that you rightly pointed out, there's Serbia, there is
they have a very good relationship there, also because of ethnic ties, or the Orthodox Church, historic reasons.
Yeah, or simply, convenience. But in all these cases, I would say that the long-term challenges, or even the mid-term challenges, are that all this disinformation and all this influence that has been ongoing here will further contribute to this to these cracks that we've been talking about, and that the societies there will say, okay, we want peace now because just give them something and then it will be fine, which is on the one hand side for me something, who would be willing to make these concessions when it's about their own country? It's easy to talk about what is happening somewhere there. But we have a misconception of geography, I would say. Because, for instance, from Vienna, Uzhgorod, which is a city in Ukraine, is the same distance as Bregenz, which is a city in Western Austria. So
because Austria goes east to west largely, so and it's quite a stretch, even though people don't realize it. The map is helpful, by the way. The map behind you is very helpful.
Yeah. So you see, if we look at where Ukraine is compared there, and so it's not that far away, and we should not make these assumptions. When we wouldn't be willing to give that up, when someone would say, well, just get rid of parts of your territory and then finally we can end this war. On the other hand, also of course this influence that is coming not only to the societies but the governments directly from Moscow is something that will remain a challenge here. But what we have seen. So I would say if we are not countering what is happening here, on the one hand side militarily, but also on the other hand side these narratives and fake news that are spreading, then yes, the Russian Federation will not end simply with whatever people want to give them at the moment, because it will continue to expand its influence. But I think that militarily at the moment, I can't really see that. But we must also not underestimate the willingness of the Russian elites to sacrifice their own people. And they have vast numbers of people that they're willing to sacrifice.
They have sent Muslims from their Caucasus regions, Chechnya, Dagestan, etc. They've sent prisoners. So in the words of a friend of mine who is in the US government, he said something brutally, but he has a point. He said that Ukraine is losing the flower of its youth, whilst Russia is getting rid of its deplorables.
Yeah.
So that may or may not be true, but actually that is certainly there's more than an element of truth there. But this is important for the scenarios that unfold from now on. And one of the scenarios that brings me on to a very important point is that there are cultural rifts within Central and Eastern Europe. Poland and Hungary are wedded to traditional Catholic values. Poland has, in fact, got into trouble with the EU regarding that. And so has Hungary, actually. Hungary for other reasons, too. And Ukraine, on the other hand, seems to have embraced liberalism and secularism. And so have many other countries, the Czech Republic, arguably, the Slovenians as well. Austria, you could make the same case. So what happens because of these cultural rifts? Of course, there is conflict within all of these societies, the traditional versus the modern, the religious versus the secular. But is it also going to create new rift lines between states?
I don't think that those will be decisive rift lines. I think that the overall division that is coming up will be something between liberalism, democracy versus totalitarianism, autocracy. I think this is something that we wouldn't have imagined, probably. That we
not in 1991 when there was so much hope. Not in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. I still remember when I first visited Berlin, there was so much hope.
Yeah. And I mean, poor Francis Fukuyama's End of History is misquoted a lot of times because it was not all just, he said, and democracy will spread and that's the end of history. It's not, as everything in life and politics, it's never very easy and very simple. But the overall state of democracy is declining in the world. And this is a worrisome development, and this is going to be the rifts rather than anything else. And it's not ending in Ukraine, because it's already brought also to Central and Eastern Europe and the countries you have mentioned. Because again, also here, I very much admire the reaction and the capability of Poland to alleviate the situation with regards to the war in Ukraine and the resulting refugees. I, at the same time, can be very appalled by certain laws that they are doing where they take away rights of women on grounds of actually Catholicism, and at the same time also have treated the challenge of migration in the European Union before the full-scale invasion happened. And this is not, it's not, you can support certain policies and despise others in a democracy.
Yes, absolutely. I concur. That is the case with all governments. I have a friend from the Labour Party who said he despises the Tories and he doesn't like Rishi Sunak one bit, especially over the non-dom tax issue. But he admires Sunak for succeeding where Boris Johnson failed and getting the Northern Ireland Protocol done. And so clearly Rishi Sunak has attention to detail and is willing to listen and negotiate, maybe because he's a former banker from Goldman Sachs. He's done deals. But he said he admires Rishi for getting that deal done. So I concur with you completely. I wish people were less partisan and polarized than they are today. We can admire some things in some parties and some governments, and yet at the same time be critical of others. And I think that is the beauty of democracy. But you've touched upon a very important point about the decline of democracy worldwide. And of course, bigger democracies face bigger problems. The role of money, where I sit here in Washington, D.C., in U.S. politics is dangerous. In Congress, congressmen spend 60-70% of their time just fundraising. So what's the time they have to write laws, the job they are actually supposed to do? So democracy worldwide is in crisis. I have a full podcast on it. My question is, what is the health of democracy in the region where you sit, where you study? How do you analyze it? How do you foresee it? And do you think this region, which began with such great promise in 1991, can survive the tumult?
It's a very complicated question again, but a very relevant and a very, very good one. I would say if we quote another famous scholar that started his theories around that even a bit before the 1980s, 1990s, Huntington with
Tamil Huntington, the clash of civilizations.
I would rather go here though for the waves of democratization.
A book few people know about, but very important.
Yeah, and he already mentioned there that there is always an authoritarian counterwave, after a wave of democratization. So it starts, after the Second World War, decolonialization throughout 70s, 60s, 70s, and then collapse of the Soviet Union, Berlin Wall coming down, etc. So my hope would still be that it's simply an authoritarian counterwave. But we have seen this wave building up to some sort of tsunami over the past years. And I don't know if we are able to survive this, if democracy is able to survive this. Because not only is it threatened by authoritarian regimes that have different tools to their arsenal, not only violently oppressing democracy in their own country or neighboring countries, smaller countries, but also the power of propaganda and simple answers that cannot be countered by democracy, because it's the very essence of democracy to be slow and to find a compromise and to reach a conclusion after exchanging points of view. What it also is happening, and this is the danger, and you've mentioned parts of it already, that when did it stop to become okay to support parties or policies when it comes from a person that we don't necessarily like or support? Because there might be political opponents that we don't like, but we can support good policies. And as you mentioned in your example, I'm not very well versed in British politics, to be honest, but I also found it remarkable that after all this upheaval within the Tories and the constant changing of their prime minister, that now this Northern Ireland Protocol, which seemed to be a absolute catch-22, has been solved suddenly. And there we can see that if people work together to find solutions, it's going to be critical to stop ignoring ideas just because they come from the wrong political party or the wrong person. And this will be the major challenge also in that region, that we are not going down that road further polarizing, but trying to listen more to each other.
Brilliant. We've come to the end of our time. You've talked about the external challenge of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and the internal challenge of division and polarization. On that note, I'll end on with an optimistic prayer, hope, wish, whatever you want to call it, that may we have more dialogues like the one we had today, maybe have more discourse, maybe agree to disagree, maybe have more harmony, not discord, and may democracy survive. On that note, Sebastian, an honor. We'd love to have you back. Good luck with the book. It's an important book at an important time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for talking to me. It was a great pleasure, and beautiful final words from you, Atul. And I hope to be back very, very soon. Thank you very much.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.